Hello, my name is Laura Delsa. I'm from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and I will moderate this session. I welcome everyone to this session, which is called Way Towards Emissions Neutral Societies, Challenges and Opportunities. And we will hear the contribution of 4 ongoing Horizon 2020 projects, which are Paris Reinforce, Locomotion, Navigate, and Verify. Slide, please. Right, thank you very much. So as you see, I give you a short view of the agenda of this session. After my brief introduction, we have the 4 presentations of the 4 project coordinators. And after these presentations, we have time for question and answers. And this question and answer sessions will work through Slido. And you will see Slido on the platform, on the left corner of the platform, and it is a red icon. And I kindly invite you to ask your questions already during the presentations via this channel. So I would now hand over and give the floor to the first presentation, which is a presentation of Harris Dukas from the National Technical University of Athens, who is the coordinator of the project Paris Reinforce. Next slide, please.
Thank you very much, Laura, and thank also to all participants that even virtually are participating in our joint event. I'm Harris Dukas, Associate Professor of NTUA and the Scientific Coordinator of the Horizon 2020 project Paris Reinforce, and my presentation is about getting a grasp of ambitious targets and the role of green stimulus. Next slide, please. So a few things about our project. It's a project that started 2.5 years ago, and we want to deliver on the Paris Agreement and to support the design and effective implementation of climate policies all around the globe and within Europe. So we have 13 European partners and the US the coordinator, and we have 5 non-EU partners, mainly major emitters, as well as some countries, developing countries. The idea is that we have integrated assessment models in the heart of our discussion of our activities, and we extend policy questions. We are a demand-driven project with a strong co-creation component, and we try also to stress test our results under different types of uncertainty. Next slide, please. So to understand how we can accomplish the Paris temperature goals, we first need to get a solid grasp of where we currently stand. So we set out to explore in detail where policies currently in place and policy targets, as in NDCs, as of 2020, would get the world in terms of emissions and temperatures. To do that, we also reduced unwanted model response heterogeneity via extensive harmonization of data inputs across models, and we found that a temperature range of 2.2 to 2.9 Celsius by the end of this century would be the case. This is, let's say, considerably lower than landmark studies, other landmark studies, including, for example, the 2020 UNEP emission gap report, which says that we will be from 3 degrees to 3.9 degrees Celsius. Next slide, please. We then delved into Europe, and aside from a detailed projection of where the region is headed, we co-created in a workshop with stakeholders our research questions for a study based on 11 models, and we found that Europe is on track to meet its outdated, though, 40% target by 2030, but with policies currently in place in 2020, again, we are inadequate to approach the 55% target that was recently announced. And as you can see, even with negative technologies, we do not achieve carbon neutrality. We have a gap, we still have a gap in till 2050. Next slide, please. So based on these realistic, let's say, trajectories of current policies, we try to optimize the allocation of COVID recovery funds, assuming part of the green stimulus goes into technology subsidies. So, for example, for Europe, we found that green recovery funds can help the EU create up to 1.5 and 0.2 million new jobs by 2025 and 2030 per year, respectively, and further cut emissions by 300 to 800 million tons CO2. First important point, though, is that there is a clear trade-off between subsidy portfolios performing well in terms of employment and those performing well in terms of emission reductions. For instance, onshore and offshore wind investments significantly boost energy sector employment, while, for instance, investments in biofuels are found to perform relatively better. However, there are important cautions regarding sustainability and availability, especially with regard to advanced biofuels. Moreover, investment portfolios favoring already cost-competitive technologies like onshore wind and solar photovoltaic may create most jobs by 2025, but will quickly lose momentum, leading to negligible, let's say, jobs gains over the entire decade. This is because these certain investments only pull forward employment opportunities that would have been created anyway before the end of the decade under the current policy framework. On the other hand, prioritizing currently less competitive technologies like offshore wind or CSPs may alter the current trajectory expected under current policies, allowing for diversification of technological capacity with an ongoing positive effect in the future and the creation of longer-lasting job opportunities. Next slide, please. So now what we are doing is that through a very detailed co-design, co-creation process, as you can see, we are now within the second series of national workshops all around the globe. We are trying to create a Paris Agreement compliant mitigation scenario, global one, and then European, and for some also major regions and emitters, and of course, to proceed towards regional analysis of trade-offs and co-benefits between these mitigation scenarios. Next slide, please. These are some selected references of the work that was already presented, and which you can find more details about things discussed. Next slide, please. And that's all from my side. I hope I was concise enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Harris. So I directly give over to the second speaker, and this is Jaime Nieto Vega from the University of Valladolid and the coordinator of the project Locomotion.
Thanks. I'm Jaime Nieto, research fellow at University of Valladolid, Spain, and I'm presenting the work developed within the framework of the H2020 European project Locomotion. The title is The Hidden Material Cost of Green Technologies. Next, please. So we are going through this topic regarding the renewables dependence on non-renewable materials that are also currently used for other economic activities, mostly related with the IT sector, but not only. So many questions arise regarding this topic, such as what are these critical materials? What are they mined? Where are they mined? How much can they be recycled? How can they be substituted? And eventually, do we have enough of them to reach net zero? And next, please. And next. Next. Next, please. So these are some of the research that have been performed during the recent years about this topic. So this is something that is in the public debate at the moment. And now, next slide, please. we are going to explain this topic, where we have modeled an energy transition scenario that have been published in several journals that we can see here. Next, please. So we know that renewable energies infrastructure demand materials, mostly for their construction, but also for operation. For instance, 50 megawatts of an onshore wind farm demands high quantities of steel, iron, copper, aluminium, etc. Also, 60 megawatts from a photovoltaic solar plant takes a great amount of iron, aluminium, copper, steel, chromium, etc. And I have only mentioned those that are the more important ones, but there are more of them, as you can see in this slide, both for construction and for operation. Next slide. The same for electrical mobility. Different models of electric vehicles embody materials like aluminium, copper, iron, lithium, important for batteries, also manganese, etc. So what are the material requirements of scaling up renewable technologies to reach net zero? As we can see, these materials are repeated among the different technologies. So the next slide. Here, it's important to differentiate two concepts. For each material, there is a number of recoverable resources on Earth, and a share of them are considered to be reserves. Regarding the economic feasibility of their extraction, the degree of geological certainty, and their increasing accessibility. Therefore, our resources are considered to be more or less stable and constant a long time. But reserves are socioeconomically determined and are more prone to increase in the future, but remain highly uncertain. Although the literature typically focuses on the current levels of reserves, in this presentation, we are contrasting against the current levels of resources instead of reserves. Therefore, we are adopting a conservative approach. Next. So we have designed a 100% renewables by 2060 scenario with the Medea's world model developed by Locomotion, with different hypotheses such as relatively high economic growth, lower population growth as more countries enter to the next stages of their demographic transitions, high renewables penetration rate, increased energy efficiency, and an increased transition to electric vehicles as well. Also, the recycling rates have been kept constant along the simulation. So these are the hypotheses that we have taken into consideration for this simulation. And from that, please disregard this line, because we are looking at the minerals availability against the total demand of each material, and also against the current levels of resources instead of reserves, adopting this conservative approach. Next, please. So we see that tellurium, indium, lithium, tin, and silver for green technologies would take more than 50% of total demand, and others are significant share as well. For instance, gallium, copper, aluminium, cadmium, lead, manganese, molybdenum, nickel, that would take between 10% and 50% of total demand of these materials, only for the green technologies. Next, please. Next, please. So similarly, we see that beyond the 100% of current resources, the red dotted line, we have tellurium, we have silver and indium, but also significant shares for tin, lithium, and copper. And this is the conservative approach, as I said before. Had we taken reserves instead, we would have seen these significant ones, also trespassing the 100 barrier by large. Next, please. Next, please. As a conclusion, we have to deal with the inherent uncertainty in the estimates of mineral reserves because they depend on prices, they depend on geological factors, regulation, technology, etc. But being said that, a transition to renewables is both necessary and possible. And as we know for other research, it potentially creates jobs. However, our results show that this is hardly possible according to the current socioeconomic system. Therefore, in order to avoid strains in the supply chain, as those that we are witnessing in the real world today, that would potentially harm the economy and the transition to net zero, and also to avoid the violation of human rights in the mining countries, policy action would be recommended. It is important to reduce demand and also stop taking for granted that demand is going to increase forever, and also to take steps to secure both environmentally and socially sustainable supply chains. For instance, by forcing firms to publish their carbon and social footprint of their supply chains. Next, please. These are the references of the presentation, and this is all from my side. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jair. So I give over to Elmar Kriegler from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, who is coordinator of the project Navigate. Next slide, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm representing the Navigate project that develops the next generation of integrated assessment modeling. Those models are used for developing global mitigation scenarios. If you could go to the next slide, please. And we are focusing on a number of key areas that are important for improving the pathway modeling. One is to model transformative change, both the supply and the demand side. The other one is representing distributional impacts better, and finally improving the usability and outreach connected to integrated assessment models. So here we have I'm focusing on 3 research questions. One is structural change, and can the structural change in the economy help or hinder the transition to net zero? What is the role of different sectors in this race to net zero? And what are social implications of policies to reach net zero? To the next slide, please. Looking at structural change is an example of India. The first point is that it needs to be reflected better in the modeling, because depending on your structure of the economy, whether you have a very industrial-based, agriculture-based, or service-based economy, your mitigation challenges and mitigation opportunities are very different. So here you can see the example of India, where we will see an increase, strong increase in service and a phase out of agriculture, or a strong reduction in agriculture, leading, of course, also to a strong increase in energy demand from the service sector, meaning that the carbon intensity, since it's lower than in the industry sector of the overall economy, will decrease. But still, this is not leading to a reduction of overall emissions, per capita emissions level for India. Rather, there's still a strong increase. So the mitigation challenges for India moving along is going to change over time. And that is something to reflect better in pathways. Let us move to the next slide, please. Looking into individual sectors and how the transition would affect those, here's an example of the energy sector. On the left-hand side, you see a study that looks into changes in value added of fossil fuel sector and electricity sector. And of course, the general picture is as expected. Electricity gains, becomes much more valuable in a decarbonizing world. Fossil fuel loses. But it puts, this model comparison puts some numbers to it, and shows that there's also some regional variation here. On the right-hand side, we look at the job effects of this transition to net zero. the result from different studies is fairly robust. There will be a net gain of jobs in those new low carbon energy sector, overcompensating the loss of fossil fuel jobs. But of course, that's not distributed geographically homogeneously. So there will be regions that lose and others that gain. And so this needs to be taken into account when it comes to exploring a just transition. Next slide, please. Now, looking into the industry sector, and so our project did a few studies trying to identify roadmaps to net zero emissions in the industry sector. It is a multifaceted problem, as pointed out by this study, where there are different strategies for different industries here. So in iron and steel, the scope for electrification is very high, and probably the main route for decarbonization. Clinker and cement sectors have to rely on carbon removal technologies to neutralize some of the emissions. The chemical sector, there's an important topic is the closing of carbon and material loops. And finally, in the pulp and paper sector, zero carbon heating is an important topic. So taken together with a portfolio of measures, this can help to bring the industry sector close to net zero. Next slide, please. Another study looked at the potential of electrification and confirmed the results of the study I just presented. So with established technologies, 78% of the energy demand in industry could be electrified. You see this in the yellow bars in these overall bars. And that could lead already to halving of emissions from industry. However, you could go further with advanced electrification technologies and almost electrifying all of industry, leading to a reduction of about 80% of industry emissions. And what would then remain are residual process emissions from mostly cement and chemicals that cannot be tackled with electrification. Next slide, please. Moving on to the land sector. Here we have an investigative study where we not only looked at land use emissions from vegetation, but also from peatland. And the study showed that there's a large contribution of peatland emissions to land use emissions, which needs to be taken into account. So even a peatland restoration strategy, which you see in the middle panel, does not eliminate the emissions of peatland. Sorry, it's a peatland protection strategy. Because of the already existing degraded state of the 60% of the peatlands, but a strategy that would involve restoration of peatlands in addition to protection on the right-hand side in the right panel would actually help to bring overall land use emissions to a net negative, make the land system a sink. Next slide, please. Finally, last view into the sectors, looking into the building sector. This is for the European Union. There are various methods to reduce emissions, and the focus is in the debate is on improve, meaning improving building codes, renovating buildings. But there are other options like avoid, for example, the reduction of per capita floor space and a higher heating set point, or shift to multifamily homes, shift to electricities of various kinds. If you look at the impact of these various options, then certainly improve has an important role to play, but improve is not reducing the floor space, as you can see on the right-hand side. So it still has direct emissions left that can then be further reduced by avoid and shift strategies, as you can see in the lower graph, comparing the two bars circled in red. So let me move to the next slide, please. Now, finally, last slide here, let me take a look at the distributional consequences of the race to net zero and the transition to net zero. Carbon pricing, we all know, will play a very important part. And on the left-hand side, you see a graph showing the regressivity of carbon pricing for households in Europe. And that clearly shows, grouped in expenditure, decides that the largest relative cost accrue for the poorest households. So there need to be additional policies to compensate these distributional impacts. And one important policy is using the carbon price revenues to actually compensate poor households. For example, a lump sum transfer could achieve that. And the right-hand side is this global study looking at people in poverty across the world, where you can see that when there's a revenue neutral use of or inequality neutral use of the carbon price revenues, you see an increase in the people living in poverty due to mitigation policies. While if you have a progressive redistribution scheme, then poor households benefit, and there can actually be a decrease in poverty or people living in poverty around the world due to using the carbon price revenue for these purposes. So next slide, please. That's a summary of the papers I just presented, and with that, I finish my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elmar. So now it's time for Philippe Pellin from the Climate and Environment Science Laboratory and coordinator of the project Verify.
Hello, good morning. So I will now move on to a slightly different subject. So after investigating how we can go towards a net zero trend, I report what the Verify project is aimed at. It's a European project. And really, the idea is, can we construct a system based on independent observations that could be used to monitor greenhouse gas fluxes, really to survey the progress of each country towards this net zero emission goal. So this is a big consortium, including research agencies, national research agencies, that are reporting each year to the UNFCCC their emissions. So next, please. So what is the challenge? The challenge is that these greenhouse gas fluxes, and we are focusing only in Verify on CO2, CH4, and N2O. These fluxes are highly variable in space and time, and they involve a lot of different processes. So really the objective, or the main question, can we develop a system that is based on land, ocean, and especially atmospheric observations to really estimate in a transparent and independent ways the emission from its countries that are each year also reported by national inventory agencies. Next, please. So the approach that we are trying to follow and is really based on two classes of methods, what we call one bottom-up approaches, which combine or include, all the different modeling approaches, whether they are complex process-based or more data-driven modeled, and the so-called top-down, which is so-called atmospheric inversions, relying on the interpretation of atmospheric greenhouse gas concentration gradients that are measured. Next, please. So really, the main objective is to try at the end to develop a system that could be help to verify what each country is reporting to the UNFCCC as the objective to have something very independent and transparent, and that would help us to monitor our progress to net zero emissions. Next, please. So I will illustrate a few examples of what the Verify project has done so far. And here is just a map. We are focusing on Europe as a demonstrator, although the system is built to be global at the end. But our first step in Verify, and the aim of Verify, was to focus on European countries. Here I illustrate the change in biofuel emissions over the last, from 2005 to 2015, which has increased a lot in Europe. And now it represents more than 10%, up to 15% of the anthropogenic emissions of CO2. And this is also a new player to monitor and survey in Europe. Next, please. Of course, the major aim of Verify is to provide a synthesis budget per country. And here I illustrate on the top for the CO2 anthropogenic emissions, CO2 fossil emissions, only the fossil emission for 11 countries, and I show you why. The reported emissions from 9 different sources. They are not independent because they all use different similar statistics behind, but this is different reported emission. The right bar is the emission reported to the UNFCCC by the inventory agencies. So we see differences, but most of these differences are due to different accounting systems. So it's very crucial to really carefully look at what is accounted for in which estimates. These include, for example, here there is the EDGAR, the Global Carbon Project, the BP statistic, EIA energy statistics, so, and the CDAC. So basically, it's really, really important to see whether they account for bunker fuel and how they account for that, for trades and planes, aircraft, all these fuel emissions that may be subject to different choices. And on the right, there is the first inversions for Europe, atmospheric inversion based on CO and NO2 data that will provide a first estimate. Although these inversions are at their infancy, they still provide a first rough ballpark estimates that is within the reported range. Next, please. For the land CO2, which is slightly different, here for the EU 27 plus UK, this is a synthesis that was first reported this year by in a journal in ESSD by Petrescu et al. And we see different estimates. So on the left, the reported emission by the national inventory to the UNFCCC, and then the different class of methods, whether it goes from sectorial methods to the on the right, these so-called atmospheric inversions. So we all estimate that Europe is a sink of CO2. The magnitude of that sinks vary depending on these methods. The sectorial methods models, tend to have a larger sinks. The bookkeeping approach that really estimates all fluxes due to conversions from crop to forest and vice versa have a smaller sinks, while the inversions tend also to have a larger sinks, probably too strong, and these are regional inversions over Europe. But the error bars are still very large, and we do hope with the upcoming new set of atmospheric observations to really reduce that uncertainty. Next, please. For the methane, I'm only presenting as a second example for the methane. Here, this is anthropogenic emissions of methane. On the top, this is the top graphic. It's only an analysis of the reported emissions by each country for EU 27 plus UK. And we see a decrease in methane emissions, mainly due to waste energy and also to a lower extent, the agricultural sector. So there is a decrease of these emissions. The middle graph on the right shows you in gray this UNFCCC decrease of methane emissions together with two other estimates, and they are roughly showing the same trend, although the EDGAR version 5 has a slightly larger emission estimates. And what is very interesting is the estimate, the comparison on the lower left plot with these atmospheric inversion based on atmospheric methane concentration gradients over Europe using specifically regional inversions. So we see that the atmospheric inversion shows you much larger year-to-year variability and also a larger emissions, anthropogenic emissions of methane. This could be due to either the UNFCCC emission underestimates the anthropogenic emissions, or because the inversion only see really the totals, we have underestimated the natural methane emission fluxes. So these are really important aspects or issues to reconcile to have this independent system in place. Next, please. So at the end, the Verify project is producing summary fact sheet for policymakers for all of the European countries and also the EU 27 plus UK. And for each of these fact sheets, it's one page that provides you the main flux change over Europe over the 2 or 3 decades, and with a little rationale on what we are seeing, what are the discrepancies between these different methods. Next, please. One thing is that you can all have access to that through the verified web page, the product page of the web portal. There is a free registrations, and you can have access to all these gridded products and all the synthetic plots per country with the different estimates that you can visualize. And there is also an interactive visualization tool to make your own customized plot. This is focusing on Europe, and we are making annual estimates each year, so we produce a new synthesis. Next slide, please. However, during the last COVID period, there was a bit of an emergency to have a faster timeline in terms of monitoring these emissions. People during the pandemics wanted to see how much the lockdown of the economy affect directly the change in fossil fuel. So this is an approach that was developed and pushed also, contributed also by Verify, but a lot of other initiatives. And I illustrate one, which is the carbon monitor that provide nearly near real-time estimates for an ensemble of countries for most of the region of the globe. And it's based on proxy data with probably less accuracy than what we have proposed and shown you directly above, but that helps you to follow any immediate impact of economic crises or whatever meteorological situation may happen in one region of the world. Next, please. I'm just concluding that this effort is part of a longer effort that is included, followed by the European Commission, where it's a series of projects. The ongoing one now, Verify, will end up, and there's an ongoing with an overlap, the COCO2 project, and there will be follow-up. And especially the Europe will launch satellite missions also to monitor the anthropogenic emissions globally with the so-called Sentinel CO2M mission. So all this effort is part of a larger program where the objective is to build capacity to monitor greenhouse gas fluxes in complement to the reported emission by the national inventory. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philippe. So yeah, thank you very much for these presentations. I would now go over to the Slido session, and I hope that the participants had the opportunity to post their questions via Slido. And as explained, it is in the platform red icon on the left corner of the platform. And I think that the Slido questions will be shared as well with the speakers. Am I correct? Yes, here we go. Very good. Right, so we have one first question. Are the projects presented accessible to civil society? And would public utilization of them help countries reach net zero emissions? And I would like to ask the speakers to kindly answer.
If I start, at least because I was the last one for this monitoring, everything is accessible under our web page, and you can just monitor for all the European countries the progress in terms of flux emissions. And our estimate goes up to year -1. So we will produce at the end of this year new estimates that include up to last year, 2020. And they are all accessible by everyone. And the idea is to have a global coverage soon. So I think this will help to for the society to monitor, to watch how much each countries are progressing towards the net zero emissions. And you're of course welcome to send comments to the project group.
In the case of the models in the project Locomotion, all the models are intended to be published open source with different sources such as Python. We are working on games to distribute to the public society, but also, of course, regarding the public utilization of the models that are on our web page as well. These models are being used by the different European Commission projects, so they are intended to help countries reach net zero emissions.
And maybe I can add for Navigate, and I guess that also holds for Paris Reinforce. So we make our results public. For example, the scenarios we develop with the models will be collected in a scenario database that will be publicly accessible to everybody. The improvements or modules that we develop and the data we collect in the context of the project will also be offered publicly on the website. So that's particularly relevant, I think, for other researchers in other countries to use. So with this, we help really to make a contribution to public good.
Yes, also from Paris Reinforce, everything, we have a site and everything is accessible to the public. And in general, if I can say regarding public utilization and then if this helps reach net zero emissions, getting citizens involved in climate policy making is a key challenge, and we need to bring as many cities, communities, and hands on board towards this huge transition, this huge challenge, since it's not only a technological one, it's a societal one, and this is why co-creation is embedded, I think, in all or most of the projects presented.
I can add also one thing is that the carbon monitor for the near real time is fully accessible and transparent, and everyone can type on Google carbon monitor and you will have access for a large part of the world to these near real time estimates of CO2 fluxes.
Thank you very much. I would like to again ask the audience that is not a direct member or participant in this conversation to ask questions via Slido. It's a very easy chat. You can just type in your question, whatever. So please use this occasion. And I now read the second question. Reporting on ESG should become business as usual. Government should start requesting these reports from organizations applying for funds and tenders. Do we want to comment on this?
Maybe.
Yeah, if I can say one thing, or Elmar, do you want? Of course, please, Elmar.
Yeah, thanks, Haris. Just very quickly, reporting on ESG is important, and this is also done and has also challenges, because a lot of the ESG reporting is not very following clear guidelines and has different quality. So I think some developments in this space are really significant. One is that there is a push in the finance sector to report on climate-related financial risks. There are initiatives to science-based target initiatives, for example, to report on the alignment of investment decisions of companies with company targets in terms of net zero or reducing emissions. And in this context, there are also scenarios being used to assess, for example, financial risk. Lately, the Network for Greening the Financial System, a network of central banks and financial regulators worldwide, has worked with members of our consortium and others to produce such 2-degree and 1.5-degree scenarios in order to give some background for such an assessment. I think these initiatives should be strengthened. So it doesn't need to be governments necessarily. It can also be regulators and finance actors that request and impose standards on ESG reporting. Haris.
Yes, if I can, exactly this is the case. And if I can add 1 or 2 things, is that in climate policy modeling, we say that important is open science and fair data. So we need open systems and data that are accessible, transparent, and all the other things. This is also critical for ESG to avoid greenwashing and to secure that, in fact, companies and organizations are using this criteria towards sustainable development. So till now, we do not have a coherent, transparent framework for assessing with the same rules and criteria different types of organizations all around Europe and, of course, the globe. So it is really important to forward these efforts and to help to create systems that will be then applied in a transparent and easily understood way for all organizations, for funds and tenders.
On my side, what I can mention for these estimates of greenhouse gas fluxes, the freely accessible of the free access to the data is still a key question, because basically some data are freely available, like satellite observations are usually made freely available to everyone, to the society. It's just a question on how you are equipped to process these data. But of course, in our processes to estimate greenhouse gas fluxes, there are data that are not always freely accessible because they are produced by some country, like national forest inventory, the accounting of forest biomass, statistical data that are not always, or measurements that are made for soil carbon stocks that are not always made completely available. I think it's important that we push forward and that the government asks for free transparency and accessibility to these data. However, it's difficult because some groups just want to retain some privacy to their data for a while so that they can publish them or that they can use them and valorize them before they are made publicly available. But that's definitely a big subject, I think, to certain class of data that should be pushed forward globally by different agencies in the world. And that's a huge challenge, I still think, especially for in situ data.
Yes, from my side, as I said, it's important to guarantee not only the public accessibility of the data, but also the compatibility between the data from one source from another and from one country to another, because the models that we are working with are highly disaggregated and rely on this kind of data. And it's important not only to avoid greenwashing, as Haris said, but also to avoid environmental load displacement. For this purpose, this is something that I mentioned during my presentation. it would be important that, according to the ESG, to force the firms to publish their environmental and social footprint of their supply chains.
Thank you very much. So another question is, how do we make sure that pathways to reaching net zero emissions societies are also socially just, not leaving anyone behind?
If I can say a few things, this is exactly what I presented within this study about the green recovery. The European Green New Deal should not come without social justice. So we optimized, let's say, the funds for clean technologies, taking into consideration the short and long-term employment impacts. And we tried to identify which are the investments that will create good jobs, but also long-lasting jobs within the critical decade till 2030. And of course, we then delved into the most critical regions, like coal-intensive regions, to secure that while we decarbonize there and we close, for instance, lignite stations or coal stations, we immediately create employment opportunities for people working there.
Yeah, adding from my side, so in Navigate, and I presented these studies, we looked at the use of carbon pricing revenues to mitigate and even reverse regressive effects of carbon pricing. And this was done on both on the European level, on a global level, looking at people in absolute poverty, as well as for Germany in a different study, because Germany introduced a carbon price on the non-ETS sectors, mainly buildings and transport, started in January 2021. And these studies all show that if you introduce a lump sum transfer or even a more progressive scheme of these revenues to households, then you mitigate the regressivity or even reverse it so that poor households gain on average. Of course, there are some aspects that are not captured then, because there might be people in rural areas with a very carbon intensive profile that would still lose out. But I think that those cases can be dealt with in different ways. By and large, it really can be a measure to reduce existing inequalities. Having said that, I should also note that there's other aspect. One is the regressivity of climate policies on households, on poor households. The second one is, of course, regions that are losing out, and that is something Haris alluded to, where entire industries might be disappearing. So different measures are needed here in order to create new jobs. In Germany, there's also debate about the coal region and what can be done there. And there, we have to openly say there is a challenge for those regions. Come up with new industries, but some measures help. That is strengthen local universities, research and innovation clusters in these regions if they are available. There are many examples from regions that went through a structural change where university actually were driving this change, and also increasing infrastructure and connections of these regions to population hubs. These are two measures that will greatly help these regions to create new jobs.
From locomotion, if I may, it's curious because our research has shown that the most climate effective policies are also synergic to social welfare. For instance, our findings show that a working time reduction fosters responsible consumption, and as well as it improves social welfare for obvious reasons. Also, that redistribution of income to reduce inequality is positive to reduce energy demand and GHG emissions. Also, that structural change to favor socially and environmentally desired sectors could contribute to improve social welfare at the same time as the net zero emissions objective is reached. And finally, demand-side management measures naturally embody an enhancement of social welfare, such as promoting public transport or building retrofit. These are some of the policy actions that our research recommend, because are simultaneously good for the environment and for social welfare.
I don't think I can add much on that question from the aspects of monitoring, and just that it's a crucial question on society, and with transparent and verifiable systems to measure the efforts of each country, but also from each sectors, it may slightly help or provide some tools to have a more fair and just measure and mitigation approaches, or at least to not put the burden on one part of the society more than on the others. But it's just from a tools that could help us to verify which efforts are taken by which countries, groups of countries.
Thank you very much for this. The session has nearly come to an end, which is at 12 Central European Time. Is there anything further to be added by the speakers? And if not, then yes, I would thank you very much for the presentations. And I also thank very much the audience for their questions. And with this, I would close the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to
Thanks
all.
a lot. Thank you, Laura, for
you.
moderating.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.